peak at 3,000 nits compared to Samsung's 1,900. And while I wouldn't say the difference feels that massive in practice, you can still tell. And on top of that, it's got its own wet touch technology, meaning that you can still use the Redmi just after washing your hands or in the shower. Whereas in those situations, Samsung's display goes absolutely haywire. So budget phone gets an 8 for display, mid-range gets a 6, and flagship gets a 10 in this case, because this S25 Ultra literally is as good as it gets on a mobile phone today. Now, software is not as easy to rate. It's a little bit less of a clear-cut category than something like display or materials, but if you look closer, you will still find trends that do separate these three tiers of phone. So the first is that, generally speaking, the cheaper the phone, the more its software is going to lag. And this is partly components, slower chips, slower memory, but it's actually mostly down to optimization. Think about it. Companies can justify spending 6 months optimizing their most premium device of the year that customers are paying $1,300 for and that all the media are paying attention to. They can't justify anything close to that level of support for one of the 10 budget $300 phones that they might quietly slip out every couple of months. And so, generally speaking, you can expect a budget phone in 2025 to feel fast enough, but it will lag when it gets overwhelmed, and it doesn't take a whole lot to overwhelm it. Simple things like opening up the camera and processing the photos that come from that camera. There are clear delays in these processes. The mid-range phone experience tends to be a lot smoother. It feels 95 to 98% flawless, with enough work put into the software that these phones don't completely freak out when you try and flick between 3 different things. And then the flagship is like the cream on the speed cake. That 5% of extra zippiness that no one needs, but everyone wants, where you wait for basically nothing. The second difference between these tiers is updates. While this flagship S25 Ultra gets 7 years of full Android updates, the mid-range Samsung gets 6 years. And to be honest, that is on the higher end. An average mid-ranger would be closer to 4 or 5 years. And then on the budget end, you'll get 3 years if you're lucky. Plus, you get those updates slower on the lower end phones. And that makes sense. Reducing software support is literally the easiest way for companies to save millions without harming that key spec sheet that price-conscious consumers are paying most attention to. And besides, cheaper phones have the weaker hardware, right? So it's going to take a company even more effort on a cheaper phone to continually keep optimizing it, to keep adding new features, and then making sure those features run perfectly. And then the third thing is ads. The cheaper the phone, generally the more bloatware is baked in, the more likely you are to get spammed by random notifications and have recommended apps that the phone encourages you to download. And this Redmi is a prime example of that. You can't help but feel like to some extent they are trying to milk you even after you've paid your money to buy the thing. And that sentiment scales down with price. You still get somewhat harassed by the mid-range Samsung, but then magically, the vast majority of that spam just disappears when you get to the flagship. And I don't like all of this ad stuff, but I also wouldn't want to overweight it, since if it ever bothers you enough, you can almost always just disable it with 10 minutes of tinkering. But overall then, it's pretty clear that software is one of those areas where you do get what you pay for. They're all Android, they all can do pretty much the same thing, but there is a noticeable difference in the quality of how well they do it, leading to software scores of, I would say, 4 for budget, 7 for mid-range, and 9 for flagship. But there is another layer to the software these days. We hear so much about the AI features of the flagship phones, but I've been so curious how much of that trickles down into the more affordable devices. Well, the best way to think about it is the cheaper the phone, the less likely you are to get the features that would take more effort to implement. But that doesn't mean you get nothing. Because as a very base layer, even the cheapest Android phones now have access to Google's AI features, so you still get things like Circle to Search, this way to instantly look up anything on your screen, or now even be able to identify music within a video that's playing. You're still getting the smartest version of the Google Assistant with Gemini. You can ask it way more complex things without needing to word it as if you're specifically Googling for something. You just talk, with also the ability to jump into a live chat with Gemini, which I find really useful as a bouncing board. The only difference here really is that with a higher-end phone, you might get deeper integration. So for example, with our mid-range and high-ender, the Gemini Assistant can save a note to my Samsung Notes app, which has required extra work on Samsung's end to make possible. Whereas here, you will just get the basic Gemini experience, which connects to Google Apps, but nothing else. But you're probably getting the idea here. In terms of what AI things you can actually do on these 3 tiers of phone, there's not actually a huge gap at all. You know, all of these writing tools, for example, how the flagship Samsung can summarize large bodies of text, how it can auto-format things. Even our cheapest phone has equivalents to basically all of them. They don't work quite as fast as the ones on the Samsung, but they do work. You still get things like the ability to AI summarize voice notes on our budget phone. You still get real-time translation features. Admittedly, I don't think Redmi's integration is nearly as slick as Samsung's, but that's more on the brand than it is the price point. Or photo editing tools. Our basic phone still has full-on generative AI image expansion, and it works really well. As far as I can see, it works just as well as that of high-end phones, all finished off with Object Eraser. And as impressive as the one on Samsung's is, Redmi is very much in the same league with its ability to remove people and distractions from shots with zero trace left behind. The point being, in terms of AI, the scores are closer than you might think. 7 for budget, 8 for mid-range, and then 9 for flagship. And I know we've touched on performance earlier, but if you did want to go all in on performance from the perspective of gaming, then you're in for another surprise. In that, if we just run a normal, run-of-the-mill, not too demanding benchmark, we will find that the mid-ranger only comes out about 20% more powerful than the budget phone, whereas the flagship is off the scale, it's maxed out. So much so that you specifically